She hired a fake boyfriend and accidentally brought a war to the wedding. This girl thought she was just pulling up to her cousin's wedding looking untouchable, but the man who showed up was not the escort she ordered. He already knew her name, her family, and exactly how to use her to get revenge on the mafia uncle who ruined his life. What starts as a petty flex on an ex turns into betrayal, power games, and a Christmas night standoff with a gun. Yeah, this is not a romance, this is a ticking bomb in a suit.
The subject was oblivious to the psychological operation underway. Her initial strategy involved hiring a male escort to act as a social buffer at her cousin's wedding to a former partner. This was a calculated, if simple, defense mechanism. The objective was to manage familial perceptions and project emotional stability. However, the operative who appeared was not the one selected. Her failure to terminate the engagement at this point is the primary clinical note. She was compelled into compliance by his dominant presence, his gaze, his posture, his implicit certainty. The agreement was reflexive, bypassing cognitive evaluation. Only later would the architecture of the deception become clear. The man who was not the subject's expectation, a folded contract in her pocket, served as a tangible rationalization. Its formal attributes, letterhead, discreet signature, and arranged two-part payment with the first installment sent, projected a facade of control. This was a deliberate counter-narrative to her family's assessment of her, which was her core motivation. The club's entrance was marked by amber lights with sound bleeding through the glass door. She adjusted her dress, performed a breathing regulation exercise, and assumed a posture her mother termed Queen's Head, Heart of Stone. This aphorism, however, was a psychological construct, not a physiological state. Her emotional condition was one of suppression, not absence. 1 week prior, a cream-colored invitation with the initials G&C served as the trigger. Ginevra Ferrante and Connor Reed. His name induced a brief dissociative episode, resulting in her sitting on the floor for approximately 2 minutes, followed by a futile attempt at self-medication with wine. Connor Reed, her partner for 18 months, was now affianced to her cousin. The lack of acute pain was, in itself, a significant diagnostic finding. The true distress was chronic, linked to her uncle Augusto and her cousin's targeted microaggressions, where silence functioned as a social verdict. She was designated the outside niece, the descendant of a sister who defied the clan structure, a label that created persistent identity dissonance. On this occasion, she intended to project power, not apology. The contract was the instrument for this performance. Surveying the room, she sought the described target. Dark hair, tall, gray suit, name Felipe. A man at the bar fit the general profile. It had to be him. But before she advanced more than 3 steps, the man rose and turned, and her entire visual field constricted, focusing solely on him as all else became background stimuli. His height commanded space before he moved, clad in a suit of near black. His eyes were already fixed on hers, indicating foreknowledge of her position. Her motor functions ceased. It was not a conscious decision. The operative in the dark suit closed the distance, inclined his head, and stated in a low, resonant voice, "Serena." It was an identification, not a question. "Matteo Romano, I'm your date for the weekend." The agency sent an email, Matteo declared, preempting her inquiry about Felipe, his tone closing the subject. A last-minute substitution was made. He delivered this information with such placid authority that for a moment she accepted its logic. Her phone had been silenced, sequestered in her purse with her dignity and the original strategy. She had verified nothing. She could have demanded an explanation or aborted the plan, but she displayed no will to correct the situation. For once, she desired an outcome that did not require a struggle. He was not the expected variable, but the stressors were constant. The wedding, an uncle viewing her as a familial threat, a cousin marrying the man from her bed of 18 months. She lacked the cognitive reserves to reformulate her plan. "Do you understand the terms of your engagement?" she asked with a strained attempt at an authoritative voice. Matteo Romano regarded her with absolute calm and replied, "To escort you to your cousin's wedding and ensure no one presents a complaint, and that the entire family concludes I'm fine." "That also," he said, with an inflection adjacent to humor. She gripped her purse with disproportionate force and said, "Then let's go." The vehicle was dark, silent, and smelled of leather and an unidentifiable scent that imprinted on her memory with irritating persistence. Matteo drove with one hand, his posture relaxed in a manner common to men accustomed to control, not because they are unaffected, but because they have mastered suppressing its tells. She averted her gaze out the window, feigning an absence of tension. The journey to the Fiancé estate would take over an hour, and for the first 20 minutes she engaged in heavy rationalization. It was a service. A contract was in place. The fact that the driver was not the specified individual did not theoretically alter the agreement's function. She repeated this mantra like someone arranging items on a shelf to avoid what is broken on the floor. Service performed, wedding survived, family neutralized. It was not simple, but it had to appear so. Her phone vibrated. It was Isla, her best friend, who possessed a unique talent for empathic panic. "Did you retrieve him? What is he like? Send an image. Send it now." She glanced laterally at Matteo. His eyes were on the road, his expression unreadable. There was a substitution. She typed, "It is not the same man." 3 dots blinked for an unnecessarily long time before the reply came. "What do you mean it is not the same man, Serena?" She put her phone away before her friend could provoke an inopportune laugh. "Large family?" Matteo asked without looking away from the road, and without any preamble. The question surprised her, and it took a second before she answered. "The kind that makes up for quantity with intensity." The corner of his mouth shifted. It did not form a smile, but it was the first change in his facial expression since they met. "And the groom?" he asked with the same dispassionate tone one might use for the weather. "He is the ex-boyfriend." She let the information hang in the air. Matteo was silent for a moment, then, "I see." "You don't need to see," I countered. "You just need to appear to adore me." He turned his eyes to me for 1 second, only one, before returning to the road. "That will not be a problem," he said, and something in his delivery caused a visceral reaction in my stomach that I chose to ignore. I observed Matteo Romano, who drove with that unsettling serenity, his profile outlined by the road's lights, and concluded that, whatever had gone wrong with the plan, the family was already destabilized before our arrival, which was worth every cent of both payments. What I didn't grasp yet, what would take me far too long to understand, was that he had identified me before I entered that club, that the name Serena Ferrante was familiar to him, that the last-minute change was no accident, and that the man beside me knew precisely who I was, whose niece I was, and what he planned to do with that knowledge. I looked out the window at the estate's distant lights, feeling only the contract's weight and the silent heat of someone too close, who breathed too slowly and whom I had just allowed into my life. Chapter 2. Arrival at the estate. Serena. Music. The Ferrante estate was the type of property that broadcast its status implicitly. The iron gate opened with a deliberate pace, as if knowing an arrival must be properly observed, and the jacaranda-lined drive guided the gaze directly to the main house. It was white, expansive, with verandas on 2 floors and lit windows like watchful eyes. There were horses in a pasture to the left and a garden to the right, engineered over years to appear artlessly casual. I had known all this since I was 12 and had never overcome the sharp, visceral feeling upon arriving, the sense that the place was too beautiful for someone who was never treated as if she belonged. Mateo's car stopped at the main entrance, and before I could take a full, steadying breath, he was at my side, opening the door with a fluid, functional motion, as if it were simply an action to be performed, requiring no comment. I took his offered hand and stepped out, and that is when I saw the figures on the veranda. Aunt Rosanna stood with a glass of Prosecco frozen in midair, her eyes moving from me to Mateo, and back with the speed of someone making calculations she hoped no one would see. Beside her, Aunt Bettina held Cousin Lara's shoulder with the kind of grip that suggested a need for structural support, and Lara's lips were parted in an expression I would have photographed under other circumstances. A period of nonverbal assessment ensued, lasting approximately 6 seconds, a duration the subject deemed significant. The male companion, Mateo, initiated physical contact, a firm, proprietary pressure on the subject's lower back. This action, devoid of solicitation or ceremony, established a non-verbal claim. The subject reported a somatic response, a sensation of heat which she noted interfered with her rational processes. A voice, identified by its tone as Serena's, interrupted from the residence before she could advance. Ginevra Ferrante presented at the threshold, her facial expression a wide dental display consistent with a triumphant state. She performed a perfunctory embrace, then her analysis shifted to Mateo with undisguised scrutiny. Her verbal probe, "And you brought company," held a clear subtext. The subject's reply was emotionally neutral. Mateo's self-introduction was marked by verbal economy and an absence of deferential gestures. This lack of expected validation caused a fractional retraction in Ginevra's smile, a micro-expression of diminished social control. The subject noted that Ginevra's narcissism required consistent positive feedback. The welcome dinner was staged in a controlled environment, an arena simulating intimacy. The ambient lighting was calibrated to increase perceived allure and threat. The subject was seated between Mateo and her Aunt Rosanna, who began a 15-minute crude interrogation. Her inquiry, "But where did you two meet?" was a transparent attempt to confirm a pre-existing hypothesis. The response was a single data point: "At work." The subject delivered the clipped reply before her interrogator completed her action. Rosanna paused, expecting more information, but none was offered. She then attempted a flanking maneuver on Mateo, who met her with a cordiality so impenetrable it terminated her inquiry. Across the table, Connor Reeds displayed incongruent affect, his rehearsed happiness faltering. His aesthetic value was context-dependent, diminishing under direct observation. A self-assessment by the subject confirmed the absence of any residual emotional trauma related to him. What remained was a mild dissociation where an emotional attachment once existed. The subject did observe Connor's persistent, poorly concealed gaze. Mateo then delivered a low-volume vocalization near her ear, a clinical observation. "He doesn't look like a very focused groom." The subject did not respond, but exhibited an involuntary physiological reaction, a visible flush to her neck. She engaged in avoidance by fixating on an inanimate object. Mateo resumed his neutral posture, while she maintained her focus for 3 seconds longer than was normative. The patriarch, Augusto Ferrante executed a characteristic power move of delayed entry, forcing a total redistribution of attention. He used his presence as a finely honed instrument. While performing ritualized greetings, his gaze locked onto Matteo for less than 2 seconds. Augusto's expression registered not surprise, but high-speed cognitive processing, the identification of an anomaly, and the immediate calculation of its implications. He then re-engaged the subject, Serena, with a display of perfectly simulated obligatory affection. "Uncle Augusto," the subject responded, mirroring his precision. His greeting to Matteo was brief. The subject instead focused on Matteo's face, whose complete lack of affect was itself informative. The dinner proceeded with repetitive narratives and conditioned responses. Augusto then used the pretext of retrieving wine to move towards the cellar. His movement was tracked by a fractional, almost imperceptible ocular shift from Matteo. The movement was so swift, the subject momentarily questioned her own perception. Using a pretext of her own, she later observed a covert interaction in a hallway. Augusto, feigning casualness, was probing Matteo about business opportunities. Matteo maintained a closed, non-receptive posture, conceding nothing and offering no social cues of engagement. The silence between them was charged. Augusto admitted defeat and withdrew. Matteo then turned, and his gaze found the subject, a silent witness to the entire exchange. No words were spoken. He regarded her with an absolute and impermeable calm. The subject experienced a cognitive shift, realizing the dynamic had transcended its contractual boundaries. She broke eye contact and retreated. For the remainder of the dinner, she was subjected to his sustained peripheral gaze, feeling ambivalent about her desire for it to cease. Chapter 3. The subject's emergent positive affect was noted as being maladaptive. In their shared room, she attempted to assert control by dictating sleeping arrangements, stating, "You take the bed, I'll sleep on the sofa." Matteo entered, conducted a swift environmental assessment, and issued a one-word refusal. "No." He then clarified, "No, the bed is yours," with a finality that precluded debate before inspecting the closet. The subject had prepared counter-arguments but found them disarmed by his authoritative tone, experiencing the interaction as a preemptively lost contest. A remote associate, Isla, later posited that this behavior was inconsistent with his professional role, labeling it main character behavior. The subject attempted to reinforce the contractual reality. "He's hired." The associate countered, "Service doesn't sleep on the sofa." The subject terminated the exchange to avoid processing a conclusion for which she was unprepared. The estate's daily schedule was a rigid system of control masked as spontaneity. Matteo navigated this choreographed environment with an unexpected and unsettling proficiency. He demonstrated a masterful ability to modulate his responses to familial inquiries, providing cordiality precisely calibrated to offer no information and invite no further curiosity. He possessed the ability to project possession, making our affiliation clear to the room without physical contact. On the morning of day 2, the family initiated a paired horseback ride, their standard method for transmuting affection into competition. I rode with Matteo through the orange grove. His extended silence was broken by a clinical observation directed past the trees. "There is a structural compromise in that fence, third post from the left." I followed his indication. The assessment was accurate. "Are you familiar with farms?" "With properties," he corrected, a reply so concise it was both an answer and a concealment. "Is there a functional difference?" His mouth curved slightly, the potential of a smile, not its execution, as he responded, marginally. I processed his remark for the rest of the trail, but arrived at no definitive conclusion. Isla's inquiries via phone were persistent. Okay, but is there actual dialogue? Periodically, I replied. Meaning, what, Serena? You know what I'm asking? I did, which is precisely why I silenced the device in a drawer and observed the ceiling for approximately 10 minutes before acknowledging internally that an unsanctioned element had been introduced to the arrangement. The signs were minor. It was his manner of listening, not the performance of a paid escort, but the data-gathering focus of an analyst registering details. It was that on the first morning he had ordered unsweetened coffee for both of us, though I had never stated my preference. It was the maneuver in the hallway as Aunt Bettina passed with a tray, and his hand briefly touched my arm to reposition me. 2 seconds, fingers on my elbow, a stimulus that ended before it registered, yet left a lingering somatic trace. I diagnosed the situation. I was in difficulty, a fact I knew with the aggravating clarity of applying logic to a non-rational event. Connor appeared on the afternoon of the third day. I was on the back veranda attempting to process the same page of a book for the 4th time when he emerged with 2 lemonades and a smile I had classified as irresistible 18 months ago. Now it was merely familiar, like a melody heard to the point of desensitization. May I sit? He asked, already moving the chair. You are already seated, I noted, my gaze fixed on the text. He positioned a glass near my hand, paused, and then delivered a practice line. You look well, thanks. That's an observation, not a compliment. He waited a beat. You seem altered. I am altered. I turned the unread page. Connor leaned in, lowering his voice. Who is he, Serena? My boyfriend, I stated with the same detached manner one might use to report the time. He became silent. You failed to mention you were with someone. You failed to ask. I closed the book with deliberation and finally met his gaze. There was a liberating quality to finding that his face no longer triggered any response beyond a calm fatigue. And even if you had asked Connor, you're getting married tomorrow. What would you do with that information? He did not reply. He stared at the garden with the look of a person who dislikes an answer sourced from his own thoughts. I took up the book again, returning to the page I could not process, and we remained that way until he rose and departed without a word. I became aware of Matteo observing from the doorframe only when Connor's footsteps receded. He was there, arms crossed, his expression unreadable, a nonverbal communication that he had witnessed the event and disapproved of some component. He offered no commentary on it. He simply entered, occupied the chair Connor had used, and after a moment's silence, asked, Lemonade? I regarded the glass Connor had brought. It can be disposed of. The corner of Matteo's mouth shifted. I predicted you would say that. The night of the third day was oppressive. With the windows open, I lay analyzing the ceiling while Matteo read on the sofa. The silence between us was palpable, not uncomfortable, but a conscious presence. Is this your default state? I asked the ceiling. He paused. That depends on the definition of this. To be quiet without needing to fill the space? I heard the sound of the book closing. Most people talk to avoid thinking, he said. I prefer the opposite. I angled my head to observe him. He was reclining on the sofa, arm beneath his head, also focused on the ceiling. There was something in that tableau, of this large, controlled man on a sofa too small for him, a circumstance he had accepted without complaint. That caused a constriction in my chest, which I chose not to analyze further. "You are not required to stay on the sofa," I said, bypassing any internal debate. He turned his face to me. His gaze held mine for a duration just beyond neutral, but shy of a declaration. Then he replied, "I know," and redirected his eyes to the ceiling, remaining motionless. I observed him for longer than was advisable, then resumed my own study of the ceiling. The night remained warm, the silence textured, and no more words were exchanged. The near kiss occurred the following afternoon, and I attributed it entirely to the environmental conditions of the second-floor veranda. The family was engaged in garden games, and I had retreated upstairs for an unneeded sweater, a pretext for 5 minutes, away from Aunt Rosanna and her recurring questions phrased in different ways. Matteo had followed me, unrequested and unexplained. When I turned in the hallway, his proximity was closer than I'd anticipated. The corridor was narrow, and the late afternoon light from the window is often a correlate for poor decision-making. He did not retreat, nor did I. We remained in that position for a period I am unable to quantify. The gap between us was the physical measure of a choice, and his eyes held mine with that quiet, total focus he possessed, which destabilized me internally with an efficiency I was starting to find offensive. Then the aunt's footsteps on the stairs served as an interruption as punctual as a force of nature. I stepped back. He held his position for another second, as if weighing the interruption's importance, then moved away with a calmness that resolved nothing. I went downstairs holding the sweater I would not wear and stared at the garden game without seeing. Aunt Rosanna mentioned teams. Ginevra laughed at a remark from Connor. The setting sun was an aesthetic event completely indifferent to my internal state. That night, awake in the dark, the only sound Matteo's breathing, I admitted to myself that for the last 3 hours I had wished the aunts had not come. Upstairs, on the other side of the room, Matteo Romano also remained awake until just before dawn, but I did not yet have that data. Chapter 4. One day prior to the wedding, and the subject was already compromised. The day before the ceremony had attention, the Ferranti family packaged as excitement. Flowers arrived, catering was assembled, and the aunts moved through the house with an energy that rejected any outcome but the completion of 10 tasks at once. I had taken refuge in the library. It was not an ideal sanctuary, a narrow room with old shelving and an armchair that smelled of dignified mildew, but it was the one location no one had sought me out in for 2 days, and I required 15 minutes without. Someone asking if I was truly all right, using a tone that implied the opposite. The door opened without a knock. Connor Reed entered, his shoulders held in a posture of practiced humility, and he closed the door with a care that I found irritating before he even spoke. "I needed to see you alone," he said. "I needed silence," I replied, my eyes fixed on the garden. "One of us will be leaving unsatisfied." He moved to the window beside me, adopting a calculated proximity intended to make me feel the weight of his presence. "Serena." His voice was low, with the inflection he employed to project sincerity. "I made an error. I made an error with you, with all of it. And I know I have no right to say this now on my wedding eve, but if I don't, I will get married." I turned to face him. "You will get married tomorrow to my cousin, and that, Connor, was a settled matter before you entered this room." He looked at me with pupils slightly dilated, the expression of a person who did not expect to encounter calm where they anticipated finding an emotional injury. I still love you, he stated, with a conviction that, in a past version of myself, would have had an effect. But I remained internally still, like someone probing an old wound with a finger and discovering it had fully healed. My registered response was not pain, nor anger, nor any emotion of suitable magnitude for the event. Instead, a cold, peculiar lucidity emerged, the kind that manifests when one ceases to resist a known truth. You have no love for me, I stated, with the tone of a factual correction in a document. You fear marriage, and I am a familiar variable, a perceived escape. It's not the same. His mouth opened, then shut. You should leave, Connor. I returned my focus to the window, intending to be at the altar on time tomorrow. His receding footsteps and the door's closure were noted, and I observed the garden for an unmeasured period, experiencing the disorienting sense that my final link to the past had just departed without disturbance. The space it left was not a void, but something different, warmer and less defined, embodied by a man in a dark suit who slept on the sofa without protest and who had remained vigilant all night, unknown to me. The previous evening's formal dinner featured tall candles, untouched plates, and conversations designed to occupy the intervals between silences. I appeared in a dark wine dress, reserved for just such an occasion, a garment that makes no overt statement, but compels a second glance for reasons not immediately clear. When Matteo observed my descent on the stairs, his only reaction was to cease his conversation with Raphael, the enigmatic man who had arrived that afternoon, and become perfectly still for 1 second. I filed that 1 second with the focus I concealed. At dinner, Matteo remained beside me, as per our arrangement, and the meal proceeded with its predictable choreography. Aunt Rosanna attempted engagement, Augusto presided with a calculating gaze, and Ginevra projected the radiance of one who expects to be the center of attention on the morrow. Connor was positioned across the table. He was observing me with an intensity he had learned to suppress during our relationship and had since forgotten too. Matteo registered this. I knew because he became still for a different kind of second, not the appreciative one from the stairs, but a more contained, denser moment that typically precedes an action. He then inclined his body toward me. The movement was gradual enough for me to sense his proximity before contact, the shoulder near, the arm grazing mine, and his mouth close to my ear, a proximity that caused a lapse in my logical processing. Look at me, he commanded in a low tone, meant only for me. I turned my head toward his, and there was no distance. The professional space that should exist between contracted parties was absent. There was only his face near mine, his dark eyes holding an expression that was neither cold nor easily interpreted. As the sounds of the dinner receded to another frequency, he placed his hand on my face with deliberation, his fingers touching my chin with a lightness that served as his inquiry, and then he kissed me. It was not a tentative kiss. It was not an act to maintain a pretense or fulfill a role. It was measured, deliberate, and hot, in a way that bypassed all my defenses and struck a vulnerability I hadn't known existed. I registered the table conversation faltering in a wave as silence spread from one side to the other, but I was indifferent. There was a hand on my face, a mouth on mine, and a warmth in my chest that had no authorization to be there but was, with complete certainty. When he withdrew, it was with the same composure he had approached, leaving me looking at him for a second, unable to form a coherent expression before I turned my gaze to the table and saw that Connor was gone. No one was watching the door. He had exited through it. Every person was looking at us. The ants had suspended their breathing in unison. Augusto's eyes were fixed on Matteo with a look I could not decipher but logged for later review. And Ginevra's wide smile had contracted by more than 0.5 millimeter. Matteo lifted his wine glass with a calm I found personally insulting and took a drink as if nothing had occurred. I went upstairs before dinner concluded. I said nothing to him. There was either no need or too much need, which amounted to the same inaction. I entered the room, closed the door, sat on the bed's edge, and stared at my hands for a useless amount of time, trying to organize something that had no order. His kissing me was a maneuver to make Connor withdraw. It was a calculation. It was part of his professional function. It was precisely what a hired escort would do in such a circumstance. This was the logical conclusion. The difficulty was that my entire body registered the kiss as something other than a performance, and I was not prepared to engage in that internal debate. It had also been the most disruptive kiss I had experienced in years, presenting a problem of a scale I was not equipped to process that night. The knock on the door occurred 20 minutes later, 3 distinct taps unhurried. I opened it. Matteo was in the hall, his jacket off and the top button of his shirt undone. There was a subtle shift in his presentation, not less imposing or more approachable, but with one fewer layer between him and the world. We observed each other for a second that held both temperature and significance before I moved from the doorway. He entered and I closed the door behind him. When I turned around, he was too close for the pretense of the charger to remain. The kiss was not in our contract, I stated, using the most controlled voice I could produce, which was not very. It was not, he conceded. Then you should not have done it. Likely not. He did not retreat a single millimeter as he spoke, and I did not advance. Yet a strange force existed between us, not purely attraction, not purely conflict. It was a compression of both in a space too small for them to coexist without interaction. You kissed me before everyone, I said. And the statement held an accusation, but also an unnamed element. Yes. His voice was low for effect. He tilted his head slightly, and motions that brought his face a fraction closer to mine. A distance I felt more than saw. Serena, my name from him carried a different weight than it usually did, as if spoken by choice, not by protocol. The effect was for them. The remainder was for me. I opened my mouth to form a rebuttal. I had one. It was ready. It was the valid point, and then he kissed me again, his mouth covering mine with a slow, profound hunger. The kiss was an advancing wave of heat, our tongues engaging in an intimate cadence, exploring, assessing. His hand moved along my waist, sliding under my blouse to warm my skin. I exhaled against his lips as my body responded to his touch. He maneuvered me against the wall with care, his solid frame pressing into mine. I felt his distinct arousal against me as my hands undid his shirt buttons, exposing the heat from his chest. My fingers traced down his defined abdomen to the waistband of his trousers. He sighed quietly when my hand closed around him, feeling his strong pulse in my palm. With measured action, he lifted my skirt and touched me at my most heated point. His fingers entered slowly, curving with precision as his thumb created slow, perfect circles. I shivered, breathless, my hands gripping his shoulders. Then he lifted me. My legs wrapped around his waist instinctively. With a fluid and penetrating motion, he filled me entirely, stretching me in a pleasing way. Our bodies moved in a synchronized, intense rhythm. Each thrust took us deeper into the sensation. Pleasure built like an unstoppable tide. The climax, when it arrived, was overwhelming. I came undone around him in long, powerful surges, speaking his name against his neck. He followed soon after, releasing himself inside me with hot, intense convulsions, his whole body shaking against mine. The lamp stayed on for a long time, lighting our entwined, sweating forms. Only later did the hot, silent night envelop us as the estate slept outside. Chapter 5. Wedding, morning after, and all that changed. I awoke when the sun was already high, with the right side of the bed vacant and cool enough to indicate he had risen some time ago. I stared at the ceiling for approximately 2 minutes, possessing the strange serenity that follows a major event before the body has determined its reaction. There was an absence of regret. I had checked. I had traced the edge of that emotion with care, searching for any painful aspect. There was none. There was only a faintly disorienting lightness, and the scent of his cologne on the adjacent pillow, a detail I chose to keep to myself, especially from Isla. Matteo was on the veranda, holding coffee, his back to the door, observing the garden where the staff adjusted the final chairs for the ceremony. He registered my footfalls, rotating his head but not his torso, and studied me for an instant with a visage that was simultaneously more placid and unguarded, before his focus returned to the garden. "Coffee is available," he stated. I occupied the adjacent seat, and we lapsed into a quietude distinct from all our previous silences. It contained no subtext, no negotiation. It was merely two individuals in a garden at dawn, and an element of that stark simplicity struck me, for reasons I was not yet prepared to analyze, as more profoundly intimate than the preceding night's events. The rite was conducted at noon, beneath an arch of white flora that had required hours of careful construction. Ginevra materialized in the provisional aisle, wearing a lace gown of objective beauty, her smile undeniably genuine, and observing her procession, I experienced only the detached relief of one who has evaded a fate not meant for them. Connor stood at the altar with the bearing of someone executing a correct action without a complete grasp of its meaning. And when Ginevra joined him and he clasped her hands, he glanced at the ground for a second before meeting her eyes. Just 1 second, but I noted it, and Matteo, beside me with his arm in light contact with mine, also observed it and maintained his silence, which was the most appropriate response conceivable. When the celebrant pronounced them married and the attendees applauded, Matteo inclined toward me and murmured very low, "There, you've endured it." I angled my face toward him, my eyes slightly narrowed. I was never in jeopardy. "I'm aware," he said, with that placidity that sometimes signified accord and other times something else entirely. "The issue was their survival of you." I regarded him for a moment and could form no reply. Then the music commenced and people rose around us, and the moment dissolved, but it was archived with the caution reserved for delicate objects. We departed before the party's conclusion. No verbal arrangement was necessary. At a certain point, our eyes met with a comprehension that obviates language, and 15 minutes later we were in the vehicle, on the return route, the music subdued and the Fiancé estate receding in the rearview mirror. The subsequent week was the most peculiar and tranquil I had experienced in a considerable time. We remained in the city. He possessed an apartment with high ceilings, sparse furnishings, and books positioned in non-traditional locations, with the internal logic of an individual who reads in multiple settings and is unconcerned with aesthetics. It was a space that unintentionally disclosed facts about him, and I moved through it with the quiet absorption of someone acquiring a new lexicon. We prepared a meal together once. He knew how to cook with the aggravating proficiency of one who performs tasks well without ceremony, and I sliced the onion incorrectly, and he amended it without remark, repositioning my hand with his fingers atop mine in a motion that lasted 3 seconds and caused me to miscalculate the next cut in a completely new fashion. "You did that intentionally," I stated. "I corrected your methodology," he answered, his voice perfectly neutral. "With your hand, it is the most efficient technique." I looked at him. He was observing the cutting board with an expression that revealed nothing, and which I had already learned to interpret as controlled amusement, and I turned to the stove before I might utter anything he could exploit. An agreement existed between us, articulated aloud and affirmed by both parties with the gravity of individuals who believed their own words at that moment. Only for the contract's duration. No attachment, no complications, no expectations beyond the stipulated term. It was logical. It was mature. It was precisely the type of arrangement two intelligent people could sustain without incurring damage. I re-examined that line of reasoning with growing frequency over that week, which itself was data I chose not to process. After I had departed his apartment, the intercom sounded. Matteo responded and heard the concierge's voice announce 2 men were in the lobby bearing a message from Mr. Fiancé. This was not a social call. The concierge's inflection was that of someone who had deduced this before activating the system and was uncertain how to proceed with the information. "Send them up," Matteo said. The 2 men were of a type who have no need to state their function, as their manner of entering a room communicates it for them. They remained near the doorway side by side, with the posture of individuals trained to command space without appearing overtly menacing, which was, in itself, the most effective form of threat. The elder of the 2 spoke. The message was concise and had clearly been rehearsed to sound informal. Mr. Augusto Ferrante desired to resolve the outstanding issue between them before Christmas. A proposal was offered, a reasonable financial settlement for the inconvenience of recent years, and a singular stipulation that Matteo Romano was to sever all contact with the niece and ensure that the separation was permanent. Matteo remained silent for a moment after the man concluded. He stood in the apartment's center, hands in his pockets, his expression unreadable, and the silence he maintained was the kind that compels less seasoned men to fill it with superfluous words. The older man was not inexperienced. He waited. "Inform Mr. Ferrante," Matteo said at last, his voice low and utterly devoid of inflection, "that I have received the message." The man anticipated more. Nothing more was forthcoming. "Is that all?" he inquired, with a slightly arched eyebrow. "For the present," Matteo responded. The 2 men exchanged a glance with the brevity of individuals who did not wish to be observed doing so, and departed without another word. The door closed with a sharp click, and the apartment reverted to its prior silence, but it was a different silence now, heavier, with sharp edges. Matteo moved to the window and stood observing the city lights for a period that held no element of contemplation. He was processing, and for him, that was always an internal activity that manifested externally only as a quietness slightly more dense than usual. Augusto had leveraged Serena as a bargaining chip. He had inserted her name into a negotiation as if she were a transactional variable and not a person, and had done so with the casualness of one who has operated this way for so long, who had treated that niece as a movable asset for enough years to no longer even perceive that he was doing it. Matteo was familiar with that history. He had conducted research on Serena prior to the club, had reviewed enough material on the Ferrante clan dynamics to comprehend her position or her lack of one, which was more precise. The peripheral niece, the daughter of the sister who had heired, the name that surfaced on family registries, but never in strategic discussions. What he had not researched, and what no intelligence report could have predicted, was the experience of being in the same room as her, the way she maintained her footing even as the ground was being removed from beneath her. The humor she wielded as a defense mechanism, which was paradoxically one of the most authentic things about her. The clarity with which she had dismissed Connor on that veranda, without histrionics, without residue, like someone at last closing a window that opened onto the wrong sort of weather. He had entered that club with a plan that was logically sound in all its components, and at some point, between the jacaranda-lined drive and a cutting board in a Tuesday kitchen, the plan had remained logical, but had ceased to be the primary objective. His bone vibrated. It was Raphael, his consigliere, who had been tracking the movements of Augusto's operatives since they exited the car downstairs. 2 men left, no incident. Ferrante is escalating, Matteo typed in response. I am aware. We address this tomorrow. Chapter 6. She was playing too, but it was not a game. Anymore, Augusto's summons arrived on Christmas Eve morning, and his tone was not that of the formulaic calls he placed once a year to satisfy his obligation as a present uncle. It was a different tone, lower, more level, the kind he employs when he is managing a crisis and wants you to believe you are merely having a conversation. He stated he needed to see me, that there was something critical I had to know before that evening's gathering, that it concerned the man I was with. I agreed to meet him at a cafe near the main thoroughfare, as I preferred neutral ground to appearing at the estate, and I arrived early simply to have time to be seated, order a coffee I would not drink, and compose my features into an expression that would betray nothing before I knew what he intended to say. Augusto arrived in his gray overcoat with the punctuality he brandished as a virtue, took the seat opposite me, and dispensed with pleasantries. The man you are with, he began, as if identifying a problem that ought to have been resolved, is not who you believe him to be. I waited. Matteo Romano. He allowed the name to rest on the table between us, as if its sheer gravity were sufficient. Do you understand what that name signifies? You are about to tell me, I said, and he did so with the precision of someone who had prepared this disclosure in advance. The organization, its scope, the enterprises operating in layers, the reputation that existed nowhere in writing but which everyone in a particular circle understood. He used the terms danger and entanglement. And you have no idea what you're getting into with the frequency of someone who equates repetition with argument. And I listened to it all as the coffee cooled before me, and my heart produced a low, steady thrum that was the physical manifestation of the ground shifting. Because the subject Augusto was describing was not incongruous with the man I knew. It was, in fact, the only profile of him that was consistent with all the details I had mentally filed away and could not reconcile. The calm that was not learned but was innate. The manner in which my uncle's expression had altered at that first dinner. The subject's cognitive framework underwent a sudden, painful realignment as disparate data points, Raphael's sporadic appearances, the Christmas Eve operatives, coalesced into a coherent pattern. Yet an effective memory cluster resisted this new paradigm, one rooted in perceived intimacy with Romano. A hand over hers, a rare smile. this psychic artifact resisted integration with the stubbornness indicative of a developing trauma bond. Augusto observed her, anticipating a predictable reaction. After a deliberate pause, her response was delivered with chilling detachment. "I know." The subject blinked. "What?" he queried. "That I was aware of the entire situation." Her gaze remained unwavering. "From the beginning." A flicker of uncontrolled surprise crossed Augusto's face, which he quickly masked. "You are telling me you were aware of his identity when—" "I am stating," she interjected with calculated calm, "that your disclosure concerned matters already within my purview." He paused, evaluating her placid exterior, which belied a significantly less placid internal state. A subtle postural adjustment followed, a familiar tell indicating a strategic pivot. "Very well," he stated, his tone affecting admiration. "Then your acuity surpasses my initial calculations." A pause followed. "Which means you will understand my proposition." He then presented the offer: command of Romano and Associates, detailing complete management, profit sharing, and more autonomy than my own daughters will ever have. He tilted his head slightly. "Everything you always knew you were owed, and which I deliberately withheld, Serena." This final admission was a tactical deployment of truth, used for efficiency over courtesy. "The price," she stated, fully aware of the transactional nature of their dynamic. There was invariably a price. "You will permanently disengage from Romano." She held his gaze for an extended moment, then asked with unadorned directness, "Why do you desire this outcome so intensely?" He began his pre-scripted response. "I have already explained. Romano is dangerous, and you—" "No." She returned her coffee to the table. "This is not an act of avuncular protection. Your contact is limited to once a year at Christmas. This meeting is not for my welfare." She mirrored his earlier head tilt. "What asset of yours does he possess?" The ensuing silence was a more potent confirmation than any verbal admission could have been, and its duration was sufficient for her to register the accuracy of her probe. "You are asking questions that lead nowhere," Augusto stated, his cordiality now completely absent from his voice. "Or I am asking the only ones that matter." She rose, retrieved her purse, and regarded him one last time with the clarity of a major realization. "I will consider your offer." She departed without awaiting a reply, the cold street air serving as a clarifying agent. The subject proceeded to Matteo's residence, her physiological state indicating high stress, an emotion adjacent to fear. She knocked on the door with 3 impacts of greater force than planned. He opened it, immediately assessing her expression before she spoke, and gestured her inside without inquiry. "My uncle just informed me of your identity," she announced, remaining stationary in the center of the apartment. "I require your version of events." Matteo regarded her with a stillness that now registered not as coldness, but as preparation to deliver a difficult truth without distortion. And then he began his account. He recounted Augusto's systematic sabotage, the cascading cancellations of contracts, the coercion of suppliers, the redirected investments that had nullified 2 years of labor. His delivery was clinical, a recitation of facts requiring no emotional qualifiers, and she absorbed every word with an attention that was painful in its total comprehension. He then arrived at the subject of the club. "I knew your identity before you entered," he stated, his eyes locked on hers. "The escort was dismissed prior to your arrival. I assumed his role because you were the most direct vector to Augusto without his knowledge." The silence that followed was sharp, She rose from the sofa, where she had seated herself unconsciously, and moved to the window, needing to create distance for cognitive reassessment. The introduction at the club, the hand on her back, each curated memory now carried a new and colder subtext. "You used me," she stated to the window glass. "That was the objective," he replied with the same brutal honesty as before, making no attempt to soften the admission with context. She remained silent for a moment he had learned not to fill. She then retrieved her purse and moved toward the door, where she stopped. Her hand rested on the knob as she stood, processing the justifiable anger but also a deeper, heavier wound beneath it. The psychological signature of Augusto Ferrante and 30 years of polite, dismissive invalidation. That man had summoned her to be used as a transactional object for the second time in her life. He had offered a long overdue debt as if it were a gift, expecting gratitude and compliance. She turned slowly to face Matteo. He was exactly where she had left him, his quiet attention promising nothing, which was paradoxically the most honest element between them at that moment. "The safe in the estate office," she said. "Ginevra inadvertently let the password slip years ago. It's the daughter's birthdays." She paused. "And I know what Augusto keeps in there, or at least I know he keeps something he doesn't want anyone to see." She met his eyes. "You want restitution. I want him to pay for a lifetime of what he did to me." She released the doorknob. "So let's formulate a plan." Matteo looked at her for a second, and for the first time she had known him, a brief, involuntary expression of genuine astonishment crossed his face. Then the corner of his mouth moved in a micro-expression she could now translate. "Okay," he said, "but you need to tell me everything he said this morning." She dropped her purse onto the sofa and sat again, and the cold apartment from Christmas Eve gained a degree of warmth. For the first time in this entire case, both parties now occupied the same side. Chapter 7: The Safe, the Password, and the Christmas that was converted into an operation. She arrived at the Ferrante's Christmas party in a red dress her mother had given her years prior, which she had never worn because no occasion seemed to warrant its expense. That night, she donned it with the deliberation of someone choosing armor. Matteo observed her for a second that had already destabilized her more times than she cared to admit, and then said in a very low voice, "You're ready." It was not a question. "I am," she replied, and it was true with a certainty that had been absent from much of her life. He offered his arm and she took it, and together they entered the Ferrante house for the 12th Christmas of her life. But it was the first where she knew her precise objective before her departure. The party followed the typical architecture of the family's Christmases: a tree in the entrance hall, background music, tables of food that no one actually consumed due to mutual surveillance. The aunts circulated in pairs with glasses of sparkling wine and watchful eyes. Ginevra had arrived earlier with Connor, newly married and still in the phase of smiling for photographs with conviction. Augusto was in the main room, as always, the locus of a group of older men who listened with trained attention. He saw her enter and greeted her with the pro forma kiss on the forehead, his eyes shifting to Matteo for a fraction of a second before returning to her with a smile that did not reach his eyes. "Serena, so glad you came." "Wouldn't miss it," she replied with equivalent warmth, and went to obtain a glass of sparkling wine she would not drink. Outside, Rafael Conte was positioned on a parallel street with two men and a phone displaying a map of the property. Matteo had explained the plan to her the night before with the precision of someone who understood that details differentiate success from failure. Raphael secured the lateral egress point. One operative remained stationed in the office's external corridor. A third maintained the vehicle in a state of readiness. My task was to enter, access the safe, and extract its contents. The protocol was presented as simple a psychological palliative for my anticipated anxiety, a fact mutually understood between us. For 40 minutes, I maintained a social facade. I discussed the menu with Aunt Rosanna, simulated engagement while Ginevra detailed her honeymoon, and observed Augusto's movement, a slow, deliberate gait indicative of a subject convinced of his absolute control. For the initial 20 minutes, Matteo's proximity served as a stabilizing factor before he migrated toward Augusto's circle with practiced ease. This was, I registered, the designated diversion. With my uncle's attention fixated on monitoring Matteo Romano, a window of opportunity was created. I proceeded down the interior corridor under the pretense of using the restroom. Augusto's office, a room sealed by a dark wood door, was a locus of childhood exclusion, the space where adult conversations ceased upon my approach. With a steady hand, I breached the threshold, entering and sealing the door behind me without an auditory trace. The office's olfactory profile was a composite of paper, wood varnish, and the lingering scent of a cigar smoked with the rigid discipline of a man who manages his vices with pathological precision. A large desk dominated the center, with shelving on 3 walls, and a safe recessed behind a painting I had noted at age 14. That day, I had entered unannounced and observed an expression on Augusto's face that was then unreadable. It was now clear. I carefully removed the painting. The safe was a compact gray unit with a numeric keypad. I recalled Ginevra's voice from years prior, a casual remark now surfacing as critical intelligence. My father is a creature of habit. Do you realize he uses his daughter's birthdays for all his passcodes? It's profoundly predictable. I recalled her laughter, a piece of data stored without conscious purpose. I entered Ginevra's birth date. Negative. I regulated my breathing and input Lara's date of birth. The mechanism disengaged with an audible click that resonated in the silence. The contents consisted of a dense envelope, a file of financial records, and a small black data storage device. For a moment, too brief for prudence but too long for efficiency, I observed the items, sensing contact with the nexus of a narrative predating my own existence. I then secured everything and closed the safe, my motor skills functioning on discipline alone. At that moment, I detected footsteps in the corridor. Their cadence was not that of a lost guest, but of an individual with a destination. I lacked the time to replace the painting. Augusto entered his office, his expression confirming a suspicion he had harbored throughout the evening. He did not move to the desk drawer immediately. His process was sequential. Secure the door, observe the displaced painting, note my purse. Only then did he access the drawer, retrieving a small black handgun with a familiarity suggesting it was a pre-planned contingency, not a spontaneous reaction. Serena. His vocalization was entirely calm, a state more menacing than any outburst. Uncle Augusto. I mirrored his register. You are not cognizant of your actions, he stated, a final opportunity offered in a paternalistic tone. I am perfectly cognizant, I replied, my voice steady despite the internal surge of fear and adrenaline. You are shielding a man who manipulated you. He advanced a single step, assessing the distance. He entered your life with an agenda and will discard you upon its completion. Or, I countered without moving. I am protecting myself, an action I should have initiated with you long ago. Augusto's expression shifted, a subtle but significant break in his composure. A variable had been introduced for which he had not planned, and for an instant I saw past the persona of Uncle Ferrante, the patriarch. I saw a man who had underestimated his peripheral niece and was processing this miscalculation too late. He raised the weapon, initiating a state of tachypsychia where time perception dilates. Every detail achieved high resolution: the lamplight, the cigar scent, the distant sounds of the party from another reality. It was me, facing my uncle, compressing 3 decades of perceived inadequacy into a single clarifying moment of arrival. The door opened. Matteo Romano entered with the quiet authority of one who requires no announcement, followed by 2 men whose function was clear without introduction. In the hall, Rafael Conte held his phone, his expression conveying the successful execution of our plan. Augusto remained frozen, the weapon raised, his eyes on Matteo as he performed a rapid, unfavorable recalculation. Matteo crossed the room and positioned his body between my uncle and me, a deliberate declarative act of shielding. He did not address the weapon. His gaze remained fixed on Augusto, a display of absolute calm I now understood as the ultimate manifestation of power, the kind that is inherent, not projected. "You know my identity," Matteo stated in a low, definitive voice, "and you know what the contents of her purse signify should you choose the wrong way to exit this room." Augusto was motionless. "Lower the weapon, Augusto." It was not a request, it was a statement of fact, delivered with the certainty of a foregone conclusion. After a silence of exactly 3 seconds, the gun was lowered. Matteo's posture remained unchanged. There was no visible relief, only the confirmation of an expected outcome. He turned his head toward me briefly, a non-verbal inquiry into my condition. I responded with a slight nod, confirming I was unharmed. His attention returned to Augusto, his expression that of a man with issues to resolve, beginning now. I braced myself against the bookshelf, taking my first deep breath in minutes, my cardiovascular rate still elevated. I observed my uncle across the room, diminished, older, exposed, and felt not victory, but the quiet finality of a long open matter finally achieving closure. In that room, on that day, Matteo Romano held situational dominance, a reality Augusto Ferrante had grasped too late to alter the outcome. Chapter 8. Terminating the contract. Augusto was restrained by Matteo's men with a silent procedural competence that negated any need for theatrics. There was no shouting, no disarray, no evidence of the confrontation that might permeate the walls to the oblivious celebration beyond. My uncle sat in his own chair, his wrists bound, his expression still engaged in calculation, his primary mode of cognitive functioning. Matteo stood opposite the desk, allowing a significant period of silence to act as a psychological tool before he spoke. The terms that followed were articulated with the cold precision of a legal contract, offering conditions and consequences without any possibility for negotiation. The documents in my possession he enumerated with the calm detachment of an analyst presenting a report were sufficient to dismantle Augusto's reputation in multiple sectors and countries. All assets appropriated over the past 3 years were to be returned. Financial compensations were to be made on a strict schedule. Finally, Augusto Ferrante was to permanently cease any use of the Romano name, effectively accepting his defeat and a significant loss of his personal wealth. Following Mateo's disclosure, the subject's uncle exhibited a protracted silence before redirecting his focus from Mateo to the subject. He displayed a novel facial expression, which she required a moment to identify due to its incongruity with his established persona. It was the affect of an individual confronting a reality he had willfully ignored. The subject offered no verbal response. Any statement she could make had been rendered superfluous by the preceding 15 minutes of irreversible revelation. She pressed the portfolio of documents to her chest, maintaining his gaze to ensure the act's significance was registered, then disengaged, signaling the conclusion of her involvement in the immediate matter. Raphael entered to manage the procedural outcomes, and the subject exited into the hallway. Her gait was more stable than her physiological state, as her knees exhibited minor tremors, a delayed somatic response to the dissipation of threat. Mateo located her minutes later in the corridor, beside a window overlooking the garden where the celebration continued, its lights and music insulated from the events that had transpired 20 meters away. After a moment of shared silence observing the scene, she presented the portfolio and stated, "This is yours." He accepted the case but did not inspect its contents. After a brief pause, he met her gaze with a complex expression she was still learning to decode, and from an inside pocket produced a document folded into quarters that she identified on sight. It was their initial contract, the original copy bearing her signature. Mateo had acquired a controlling interest in the agency 2 days after their first meeting, a strategic move ensuring all documentation concerning the subject was routed through him. She remained ambivalent about whether this information provoked an excessive or an insufficient degree of irritation. He offered the document to her without comment. She examined the paper, her own handwriting, the date, and the financial terms that had seemed pragmatic on a night she required an ally for a familial conflict. The entire artifact now felt alien, belonging to a different individual from a life preceding recent transformative events. The subject proceeded to tear the contract. The acoustic feedback from the paper was unexpectedly satisfying. A clean, definitive sound, precluding any possibility of repair. She collected the fragments in her palm and then observed Mateo retrieve his own copy. His possession of both versions was noted for later analysis. He, too, destroyed the document with his characteristic economy of motion. They stood holding the shredded paper, and the ensuing silence was longer and more weighted than their previous interactions. The subject then emitted an unplanned laugh. It was a cathartic release of accumulated tension, the psyche's response to a sudden cognitive vacuum. The laughter was a compound of relief and an awareness of the absurd, noting the objective ridiculousness of their situation, standing in a ranch corridor at Christmas with handfuls of torn paper. Mateo observed her and then mirrored the behavior. It was the first time she had witnessed not a controlled smirk or a rare, guarded smile, but a genuine, spontaneous laugh that surpassed its intended duration. The display altered his facial topography in a way she could not articulate but observed with intense focus, recognizing it as a rare phenomenon. There, she experienced a moment of inconvenient but absolute clarity. She was profoundly emotionally compromised, a condition she had been denying for some time. The contract had been a naive psychological defense, an attempt to maintain boundaries that she could now forgive as well-intentioned. Mateo's laughter subsided before hers, but his expression remained altered, more exposed, with one less defensive layer, an affect she had observed only once prior. "You could have departed," he stated in a low tone. "When I opened the door, you had secured the objective. You could have left sooner, Correct, she conceded. But you remained. I remained. He observed her for a moment with his typical focused stillness, then raised his hand. He slowly brushed a strand of hair from her face, a gesture that was not one of intimacy, but of assessment, as if he were solidifying a decision during the act. When his hand came to rest on her face, it lacked any strategic motivation. There was no social performance, no audience, only the corridor, the dark window, and the contract fragments now discarded. The arrangement is terminated, he said, his voice even lower. It is terminated, she affirmed. What is the subsequent protocol? He asked. The question was genuine, devoid of assumption, the kind posed when an individual who micromanages all variables cedes control over a single outcome to another. She observed him for a second, his layered expressions she had learned to interpret, and the eyes that had singled her out before she ever entered that club, and which had, for reasons that began as calculation but evolved into something else, never wavered when she was present. Whatever follows, she replied, but without a contract. The corner of his mouth shifted, and this time she allowed her own to do so. Outside, the Ferrante gathering persisted. Rafael Conte was likely making a sardonic remark to no one, and Christmas proceeded with its characteristic indifference. None of it registered with the same significance as the door down the hall, closing from within moments later, and the silence that followed. Chapter 9. Unforeseen Contractual Variables. 2 months post-Christmas, the apartment formerly belonging to Matteo had transitioned into a shared living space without formal agreement. Her possessions had integrated incrementally, first a toothbrush, then a deliberately forgotten coat, followed by a drawer, then 3 shelves, and one side of a closet he had cleared without comment, as if accommodating something already meant to be there. The period following the events at the estate was not uncomplicated, a reality neither of them expected nor promised. There were days of his complete emotional withdrawal for reasons she was learning to not internalize, and days her own introspection was so deep he had to repeat a question for it to register. Disagreement would begin superficially and, after 20 minutes, excavate a deeper issue, concluding when one party conceded not from a position of weakness, but as a conscious choice, a distinction she had learned to identify. Yet there were also the consistencies, the morning coffee prepared to her specific preference without instruction, the shared silences while reading in the same room, and the occasional non-possessive touch on her back, a gesture of presence, not a declaration. One February night, in the dark, she posed a question to the ceiling and to him concurrently. Do you have regrets about the genesis of our involvement? His hand rested on her back, engaged in a slow, perhaps unconscious motion. No, he replied softly. But given the choice again, I would initiate it differently. How? I would have disclosed the truth at the club. She contemplated this alternate scenario. Matteo Romano revealing his identity and objectives in that bar. She would have retreated, canceled the arrangement, contacted Isabella in a state of alarm, and spent the night rationalizing the decision. I would not have remained, she admitted internally. I am aware. The motion of his hand continued. That is why I abstained. In that darkness, she recognized the distinction between forgiveness and acceptance, realizing she had accomplished both at separate times and without conscious intent. Acceptance had manifested first, in the mundane rituals of coffee and quiet companionship. Forgiveness had followed gradually, not as a decision, but as the realization that her anger had dissipated, replaced by something more structurally sound. She had co-constructed something authentic, and authenticity has texture, mass, and duality. It was the most integrated construct she had ever experienced. The documents from Augusto's safe were secured in a location selected by Raphael, unknown to her by mutual agreement. Matteo reported that his team's analysis would be lengthy, a fact she accepted with a newfound patience, trusting the process without needing to micromanage it, a trait acquired over the last 2 months from necessity. The subject demonstrated a cognitive suppression of the documents, a displacement mechanism favoring immediate sensory reassurances. The domestic setting and the proximity of her partner, Matteo, served to temporarily lower a state of chronic hypervigilance. She reflects on the origin of their arrangement, a calculated contract which has since devolved into a codependency. This transaction, designed for strategic gain, transformed due to emotional variables that neither subject can precisely identify, suggesting a classic trauma bond. The subject initiated a state of denial, closing her eyes as the apartment's quiet was breached. An external stimulus, Matteo's phone vibrating with calls from an individual named Raphael, was consciously ignored. Matteo's own inaction suggests a collusive desire to preserve the fragile status quo. Her refusal to verify his state, feigned or genuine sleep, is a defense mechanism. Retreating into unconsciousness represents a psychological flight from the re-emerging conflict, a desperate attempt to maintain a false, perfect silence. End of part 1. For 23 years, the subject's psyche was built on a single narrative concerning her maternal abandonment, a construct internalized at age 7. This foundational belief was subsequently shattered by a 3-page file. The dossier's contents irrevocably altered her self-perception and familial history. The primary trauma, however, was not the revelation, but the betrayal signified by Matteo's gaze, a look confirming his prior knowledge and deliberate concealment. This concludes the initial analysis. Book 2 is compiled. Access to subsequent analysis is available for a nominal fee. To reiterate, the subject operated for 23 years under a flawed paradigm regarding her mother, which explained a core feeling of inadequacy. This belief, adopted at age 7, was never challenged until a folder dismantled her entire life narrative in 3 pages. Its contents redefined her identity, origins, and the source of her family's destruction. The acute psychological injury was inflicted by Matteo's expression, which confirmed his complicity through silence. This is a preface to the 2nd volume. To review the complete unredacted file, utilize the primary link in the pinned commentary. There, the analysis continues in seconds. As a reminder, that initial link provides the full, uninterrupted 2nd book. The work on this 2nd volume is proving fruitful, and further installments are planned. This is the repository for case studies of a more extreme nature, true dark romance. Due to the psychologically intense material, public dissemination is ill-advised. This private archive allows for an uninhibited presentation of my work for you. Be advised, the primary channel has been demonetized. This alternative is a method to maintain the research team and continue producing high-caliber case analyses. Further procedural updates will follow. I will await you at the first link in the pinned commentary. Regrettably, unauthorized duplication of our audio files and reposting of the complete narrative on other platforms has become a significant issue.
She thought the mission was simple. Walk into enemy territory looking untouchable, shut the family up, make the ex regret everything, then leave with her pride still breathing. Easy, right? Nope. Because life, as usual, came in with the nastiest plot twist imaginable. The fake boyfriend was not fake enough. The family she wanted to impress was more broken than she remembered. And the man she thought she hired as a shield turned out to be a mirror, reflecting the one truth she had been dodging for years. She was still living for other people's reactions. That was the real bomb. Not the wedding, not the betrayal, not even the secret agenda behind the charming man in the dark suit. The real explosion was the moment she realized that revenge is a weak life plan if it still depends on the people who hurt her. Because think about it, if she only felt powerful when they looked shocked, then they still controlled the scoreboard. She had just changed costumes, not freedom. And that is the lesson hidden inside all that Mafia-flavored drama. People love the comeback scene, they love the slow walk, the deadly stare, the look who's winning now energy. But real growth is less cinematic and way more brutal. It begins when a person stops performing healing and starts living it. She did not become dangerous because she arrived with a handsome man on her arm. She became dangerous when she stopped begging for emotional permission from a family that had never planned to give it. That is why her victory hit harder than any revenge speech ever could. She did not just survive humiliation, she outgrew the need to explain herself to the people who fed on it. And once that happened, every insult became smaller, every manipulation became easier to see, and every old wound lost some of its power. The lesson, the coldest revenge is not making them jealous, it is becoming someone their approval can no longer buy.